Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm certainly pleased to rise and speak to this motion today, put forward by my colleague from St. Paul's, who is also the Aboriginal Affairs critic for the Liberal caucus, and second by my colleague for Etobicoke North, who happens to be the critic for the status of women in the Liberal caucus as well. Mr. Speaker, my colleagues today have come to the House of Commons asking that there be an inquiry into missing Aboriginal women and girls simply because it's what Canadians are asking for. Mr. Speaker, over the number of years that we have sat in this House of Commons, going back to the Spirit of Sisters report in 2009, we have had people across Canada asking that there be an inquiry into missing and murdered Aboriginal women and girls. Well, Mr. Speaker, today, while we still have many victims out there and their families, today, while we still have grieving people in this country for lost ones, while we still have Indigenous leaders, advocates, the international community, every provincial and territorial government asking for this, including members in our caucus in the House of Commons, the government opposite continues to refuse to act on those requests and recommendations. Mr. Speaker, this is a very serious issue, one that has affected many Indigenous women and girls in our country. In fact, if we were looking at this from an international perspective, Canadians all across would be saying, this is unbelievable and something needs to be done. Well, it's no different here in Canada. It's hard to imagine that we have so many Indigenous women and girls within our country that are being abused, that are being murdered, that are being victims of violence, and yet we're seeing no action to call an inquiry into what is the root causes of this problem. Mr. Speaker, just a while ago we had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission release 94 recommendations. Those recommendations, Mr. Speaker, were regarding the unfinished journey of healing and reconciliation for Indigenous people. But in that report, they also had a call to action for government. They were calling on the government, Mr. Speaker, in consultation with Aboriginal organizations to appoint a public inquiry into the causes of and remedies for the victimization of Aboriginal women and girls. Mr. Speaker, in the Truth and Reconciliation Report, recommendation number 41 directly asked the Government of Canada to do this. They asked them to investigate missing and murdered Aboriginal women and girls, and two, to look at links to intergenerational legacy of residential schools. They did not make the decisions of the Truth and Reconciliation Report lightly, Mr. Speaker. They did so after tremendous thought and insight, after a tremendous consultation and input. And this is what they firmly believe as Indigenous people in Canada. In addition, Mr. Speaker, we have had so many more speak out. We have had the victims of families. In my own riding, a young woman by the name of Loretta Saunders, whose life was taken. Her sister, Delilah, brave young woman who stood for her sister to call for an inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women. Stood with her mother, who called for an inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women, who stood with many others across Canada. Unfortunately, their voices are still not being heard by the Conservative government. What about the family of Bernice Rich, a young woman from Natwashish, a young Innu woman who was murdered in her community, Mr. Speaker, in her neighboring community of Sheshashi, whose life was taken for no reason. Why? Because she was an Aboriginal woman? Is her life not more valuable or as valuable as all others? That's the sad commentary, Mr. Speaker, when the murderer is on trial and they can give no reason. absolutely no reason why they victimized, terrorized, and murdered this young woman. I would challenge the government to view the Highway of Tears, which my colleague from St. Paul's had invited so many of you to do. Well, I went to that viewing, and I saw the numbers of women that were missing and lives were lost on the Highway of Tears. I sat in that room that evening with family members who are grieving, and in their grief, they're looking for healing, and in that healing, they're looking for action from the Government of Canada. It is so sad to look into their eyes and into their faces. It is so sad to look at them when they tell you the stories of the many women who have been lost and murdered, but yet no actions to get to the root of the problem. Mr. Speaker, we know that this can be changed. We live in a society of hope. We live in a society where we know that change can happen, but that change takes all of us. It takes all of us working together to make that difference. The government has not been prepared to work to make that difference, despite the fact that in May of 2014, the RCMP released a report which identified almost 1,200 Indigenous women and girls who have gone missing or been murdered since 1980 in Canada. It also noted that despite the fact that Indigenous women represented only 4% of women in Canada, this demographic accounted for 8% of female homicide victims in 1984 and a staggering 23% by 2012. As of 2012, Mr. Speaker, 1 in 4 female homicide victims in this country is Indigenous. Last summer, in the wake of the Tina Fontaine murder in Winnipeg, which we're all very much aware of, which my colleague, the member for Winnipeg, has rose in this House and asked questions on in previous days. We heard the Prime Minister's insensitive comments when he said we should not view this as a sociological phenomenon and dismissed root causes as part of the problem. How can you do that when you lead a country where 1,200 Indigenous women and girls have gone missing? How can you say that when we've seen the percentage of Indigenous women go from 8% of those female victims of homicide to 23% in just a few years? How do you say that when you look at the family of Tina Fontaine, of Loretta Saunders, of Bernice Rich, and of so many more? But, Mr. Speaker, it gets worse, because as the families of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls have been clear that they have not been listened to or treated with respect or felt supported by the government opposite, the Prime Minister then made another shocking admission, and during his year-end interview with Peter Mansbridge, when he said that this issue isn't high on his radar. Mr. Speaker, he not only shocked the families that are grieving and suffering through the loss of loved ones, but he shocked a nation that feels that there should be an inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. A nation that feels that getting to the root causes of this will change it. A nation that lives in hope with action. We call upon the members of the House of Commons to support this motion that have been brought forward by the member for St. Paul and by the Liberal caucus. We ask that you support an inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in this country, just as every province and territory, every other civil organization, just like Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and many families have already asked for. Once again, we make that plea to the House of Commons. Thank you.